On May 2, 1945, at 6:15 in the morning, the gates of a makeshift POW camp outside Stalingrad opened for the first time since its establishment 3 days earlier. Inside were 847 German Wehrmacht soldiers who had surrendered to Soviet forces during the final collapse of the Third Reich. They had been marching for days, exhausted, starving, certain they were being taken somewhere to be executed. Soviet policy toward German POWs was brutal by design. Of the roughly 3 million German soldiers captured by the USSR during the war, nearly 1 million would die in captivity from starvation, disease, forced labor, and execution. The survivors expected no mercy. They had seen what the Wehrmacht did to Soviet territory. They knew what was coming. But when the camp commander assembled the prisoners for their first work assignment, something happened that none of them expected. The guards assigned to oversee them weren't Soviet soldiers. They were Soviet women, and not just any women. They were survivors from the villages the Wehrmacht had destroyed. The prisoners stood in the frozen mud, staring at their guards. Young women, most between 18 and 25, wearing Soviet military uniforms and carrying rifles. Their faces showed no emotion, no mercy, just cold, hard assessment of the men who had participated in the destruction of their homes. Among those prisoners was Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffman, age 24, a farmhand son from Bavaria who had been conscripted in 1943. He had fought on the Eastern Front for 18 months, witnessed atrocities, participated in some, survived battles that killed most of his unit. He had surrendered 3 days earlier, preferring Soviet captivity to dying in a meaningless last stand. When Klaus saw the women guards, his first thought was, "They're going to kill us all." His second thought was, "We deserve it." The tension in that camp between German soldiers who had brutalized Soviet territory and Soviet women who had survived that brutality would create one of World War II's most complex and hidden stories. A story of revenge, recognition, and the impossible question of whether humanity can survive hatred. To understand what happened in that camp, you need to understand who these women were and why the Soviet military was using them as POW guards. The Soviet Union had mobilized women for military service on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Nearly 1 million Soviet women served in combat and support roles as snipers, pilots, tank crews, medics, and infantry. Thousands more served as camp guards for German POWs. The women assigned to this particular camp near Stalingrad had specific backgrounds. They were selected from a volunteer battalion of women whose villages had been occupied and destroyed by German forces. The Soviet command's logic was brutal but effective. Women who had lost everything to the Wehrmacht would be motivated guards, unlikely to show the German prisoners any sympathy or leniency. Among those guards was Senior Sergeant Ekaterina Volkov, age 22, from a village 200 kilometers east of Stalingrad. When the Germans had occupied her village in 1942, they had executed her father and 2 brothers as suspected partisans. Her mother had starved to death during the occupation winter. Her younger sister had disappeared, likely taken for forced labor, though Ekaterina never learned what happened to her. Ekaterina had escaped and made her way to Soviet lines. She had volunteered for military service with one clear purpose: revenge. She had trained as a guard, specifically requesting assignment to POW camps. She wanted to oversee the men who had destroyed her world. The other women guards had similar stories. Every single one had lost family members to German occupation. Some had been raped, others had been forced into labor. All had watched their villages burn. The camp commander had assembled a unit of women who had every reason to hate the German prisoners under their control. This was intentional. The Soviet system knew these women would be harsh, unforgiving guards. That was the point. German prisoners needed to understand the consequences of what they had done. Who better to teach them than the women who had survived their invasion? Klaus Hoffman understood this immediately. When he saw Ekaterina's face during that first assembly, he recognized the look. It was the same expression he had seen on Soviet civilians when the Wehrmacht had rolled through their villages. Hatred mixed with fear, mixed with recognition that they were completely powerless. Except now, the roles were reversed. The German soldiers were powerless. The Soviet women held all the authority. And the hatred was about to flow in the other direction. The initial days in the camp were brutal. The women guards treated the German prisoners with systematic harshness that stopped just short of direct violence. Food rations were minimal, thin soup once a day, sometimes a piece of black bread. Water was limited. Medical care was non-existent. The prisoners were organized into work brigades and marched out daily to clear rubble from Stalingrad. The city was a landscape of destruction, entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal ruins, streets filled with debris, bodies still buried under collapsed buildings. The prisoners' job was to dig out the rubble, recover bodies, clear paths for reconstruction. The women guards supervised with rifles and absolute authority. They showed no sympathy for prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or hunger. When men fell, the guards ordered other prisoners to carry them. If a prisoner couldn't work, he didn't eat. The system was designed for maximum suffering just short of outright execution. Ekaterina supervised one of the work brigades. Klaus was assigned to her group. On the first day, he lasted 4 hours before collapsing while lifting a massive concrete beam. Ekaterina walked over, looked down at him lying in the mud, and said in careful German, "Get up or die here. I don't care which." Klaus struggled to his feet. His vision was blurry from hunger and exhaustion. But Ekaterina's expression told him she meant exactly what she said. She would let him die right there without a second thought. That night, back in the barracks, Klaus and other prisoners whispered about their guards. Some prisoners argued they should try to appeal to the women's mercy, explain they had just been following orders, that they weren't responsible for war crimes. An older prisoner, a Feldwebel, who had been fighting since 1941, shut that conversation down immediately. Those women don't want to hear about orders. They want revenge. And honestly, can you blame them? After what we did here? The question hung in the freezing barracks. Most prisoners didn't answer. They knew what the Wehrmacht had done in Soviet territory. Entire villages burned, civilians executed, women raped, children shot. The orders had come from above, but regular soldiers had carried them out. Everyone in that barracks had blood on their hands in some form. Klaus had never personally killed a civilian, but he had been present when his unit had burned a village suspected of harboring partisans. He had watched women and children flee into the snow. He hadn't stopped it. He hadn't objected. He had just followed orders and moved on. Now he was under the authority of women who might have been from villages, just like that one. The moral calculus was impossible to ignore. 3 weeks into captivity, something shifted. A prisoner in Ekaterina's work brigade, a young soldier named Wilhelm, barely 19 years old, collapsed while carrying rubble. He had dysentery and was severely dehydrated. He literally could not stand. Ekaterina walked over, rifle ready, and ordered him to get up. Wilhelm tried. He genuinely tried. But his legs wouldn't hold him. He collapsed again, crying, apologizing in broken Russian. Ekaterina stood over him, finger near the trigger. The other prisoners watched, frozen. This was the moment. She was going to shoot him. The pretense of work camp was over. Execution was starting. But Klaus did something he couldn't later explain. He stepped forward and said in German, "I'll carry his load, and mine. Just let him rest for 1 hour, please." Ekaterina turned to Klaus, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she replied in German, "You think carrying extra rubble makes you a good person? You think 1 hour of mercy erases what you did here?" Klaus said, "No, but maybe it's something. Maybe it's a start." Ekaterina stared at him. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She said, "1 hour. He rests 1 hour. You carry double. If you collapse, you both die. Do you understand?" Klaus nodded. He carried double loads for the rest of that day. By the end, he was barely conscious. But Wilhelm survived. That night, Ekaterina couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Klaus's face when he stepped forward. The desperation mixed with something else, maybe shame, maybe recognition of what he owed. She didn't know why she'd agreed. It violated everything she'd promised herself about showing these men no mercy. But something about his willingness to suffer for another prisoner had cracked her resolve slightly. Not much, just a hairline fracture in the wall of hatred she'd built. Over the following weeks, small interactions between Klaus and Ekaterina accumulated. During work details, he would occasionally ask questions in his limited Russian, questions about the rubble they were clearing, about what the buildings had been before the war. Ekaterina would answer curtly, providing minimal information. But she answered. That was more than she did for other prisoners. One day, while the brigade was clearing what had been a school, Klaus found a child's drawing book in the rubble. The pages were water-damaged, but still recognizable. Crude drawings of houses, families, animals. He stared at it for a long moment, then carefully set it aside instead of throwing it in the rubble pile. Ekaterina saw this. She walked over, picked up the drawing book, and looked at it. Then she looked at Klaus and said, "Why did you keep this?" Klaus said, "Because a child drew it, because someone should remember they existed." Ekaterina's expression hardened. "Your army killed that child. You want to honor their memory? Then carry the guilt." Klaus said, "I do, every day." That conversation marked a turning point. Ekaterina still treated Klaus harshly, still denied him any special privileges. But she began watching him differently. She noticed he shared his food with weaker prisoners. She noticed he volunteered for the hardest work to spare others. She noticed he never complained, never made excuses, never claimed he was different from other Wehrmacht soldiers. His behavior contrasted sharply with other prisoners who constantly protested their innocence, who claimed they had opposed the Nazis, who insisted they had never participated in atrocities. Klaus made no such claims. He accepted his guilt and tried, in small ways, to do something that vaguely resembled penance. Ekaterina didn't forgive him, but she began to see him as a person rather than just a symbol of the army that had destroyed her life. It was a subtle distinction that made all the difference. One evening, after the work brigade returned to camp, Ekaterina pulled Klaus aside. She said, "My village was called Novokuznetsk. The Wehrmacht burned it in 1942. Do you know that name?" Klaus said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't know that name." Ekaterina said, "Of course you don't. You burned hundreds of villages. Why would you remember the names?" Klaus had no answer for that. Ekaterina walked away. But the fact that she had told him her village's name mattered. She had given him a piece of her story. She had made her trauma specific rather than abstract. It was an act of trust, however small, however painful. 2 months into captivity, Klaus found a photograph in the rubble. It showed a Soviet family, mother, father, 3 children, standing in front of a wooden house. The photograph was damaged but intact enough to see their faces, their careful Sunday clothes, their formal poses for the camera. Klaus showed it to Ekaterina during the work detail. He said, "Should I keep this, in case someone is looking for their family's picture?" Ekaterina took the photograph, studied it for a long moment. Then she said, "That was my family. That's my house. That photograph was in my mother's bedroom." The odds of Klaus finding Ekaterina's family photograph in the rubble were astronomically small. Stalingrad was a massive city. The rubble stretched for kilometers. The fact that he had found her specific family's photograph felt like something beyond coincidence, like the universe forcing both of them to confront their connection. Ekaterina stood there, holding the photograph, her hands shaking. Klaus watched her, not knowing what to say, knowing that anything he said would be inadequate. Finally, Ekaterina said, "This was taken in 1938, before the war, before everything." Her voice was thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "My father is dead. My brothers are dead. My mother is dead. My sister is missing. This photograph is all that's left." Klaus said, "I'm sorry." Ekaterina looked at him sharply. "You're sorry? That word means nothing. Sorry doesn't bring them back." Klaus said, "I know, but I don't know what else to say." Ekaterina carefully folded the photograph and put it in her uniform pocket. Then she said, "You want to do something that matters? Then live with this. Remember that every piece of rubble you clear was someone's home. Every body you dig up was someone's family. Remember that you participated in destroying all of this, and when you go home to Germany, tell people what you did here. Don't hide it. Don't pretend it was just war. Tell them the truth." Klaus said, "I will. I promise." That promise would define the rest of his life. Word spread through the camp about Klaus and Ekaterina's interaction. The other prisoners had mixed reactions. Some saw Klaus as collaborating with the guards, trying to earn special treatment through manipulation. Others saw him as simply trying to survive by showing humanity in an inhumane situation. The other women guards noticed Ekaterina's shifting attitude toward Klaus. Some confronted her privately, asking if she was going soft on the Germans. Ekaterina's response was firm. "I'm not soft. I'm just recognizing that revenge without recognition accomplishes nothing. These men need to understand what they did, and that requires treating them as humans capable of understanding, not just animals to be punished." It was a subtle but significant shift in philosophy. Ekaterina was moving from pure revenge towards something more complex, a form of justice that required perpetrators to fully comprehend their crimes. This shift influenced how she supervised her work brigade. She still enforced discipline strictly, still denied privileges, still punished violations. But she began explaining why they were clearing specific buildings, whose homes they had been, what the neighborhoods had been like before the war. She was forcing the prisoners to see the human cost of what they had done, not abstractly, but specifically. These weren't just ruins. These were homes where families had lived, loved, raised children, celebrated holidays. The Wehrmacht had erased all of that. Some prisoners rejected this approach. They shut down emotionally, refusing to engage with the human details. Others, like Klaus, absorbed every word. They began seeing the rubble differently, not as generic war destruction, but as the specific erasure of specific lives. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. Many developed what we would now call moral injury, the trauma that comes from recognizing you've participated in actions that violate your own moral code. Some prisoners attempted suicide. Others withdrew into silence. A few, like Klaus, tried to find ways to make small amends, knowing full well those amends could never balance what they had done. 6 months into captivity, Klaus approached Ekaterina with an unusual request. He asked if he could write a letter to his family in Bavaria, acknowledging what he had done during the war, and asking them to preserve his testimony for future generations. Soviet policy prohibited POW correspondence. Prisoners were allowed no contact with families until release, if they survived, to be released. Klaus knew this, but he asked anyway. Ekaterina said, "Why would I help you send a letter?" Klaus said, "Because you told me to remember. You told me to tell the truth when I go home. I want to write that commitment down now, while it's fresh, while I'm still surrounded by the evidence of what we did. I'm afraid if I wait until I'm released, if I survive that long, I'll rationalize it. I'll soften the truth. I want to write it now, honestly, while I can't hide from it." Ekaterina was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I can't send a letter, but I can let you write it. Keep it. If you survive, you take it home. If you die, I'll send it myself. That's my promise." Klaus wrote the letter that night. 6 pages, carefully detailed. He described his unit's actions, the villages they burned, the civilians they killed or displaced, his own complicity through silence and inaction. He described the faces of Soviet civilians, the terror in children's eyes, the sounds of homes burning. He described his shame and his commitment to spend the rest of his life bearing witness to what he had participated in. He gave the letter to Ekaterina. She read it completely, then folded it carefully and kept it in her personal belongings. She said, "If you survive, you owe this truth to the world. If you don't survive, I'll make sure. Someone knows." That letter became a bond between them, a shared commitment to truth-telling that transcended their roles as prisoner and guard. In February 1946, nearly a year after capture, the POW camp was liquidated. Most prisoners were transferred to labor camps in Siberia, where survival rates were even lower. Klaus was among those transferred. Before the transfer, Ekaterina pulled Klaus aside. She returned his letter and said, "You're being sent to Kolyma. Most men don't come back from there, but if you do, keep your promise. Tell the truth." Klaus said, "If I don't survive, will you still send the letter?" Ekaterina said, "Yes, but you should plan to survive. The world needs more Germans willing to tell the truth about what happened here." They stood there in the frozen morning, prisoner and guard, connected by shared history and an impossible understanding. Then Klaus was loaded onto a transport truck and disappeared into the Soviet labor camp system. Ekaterina watched the trucks leave. She felt something unexpected, hope that Klaus would survive, that he would keep his promise, that at least one German soldier would bear honest witness to what had happened. The other women guards asked why she cared whether a German prisoner survived. Ekaterina said, "Because if all the guilty men die without acknowledging what they did, then history gets written by people who weren't there. We need witnesses, even guilty witnesses." Klaus spent 4 years in the Kolyma labor camps, some of the most brutal in the Soviet Gulag system. He worked in gold mines under conditions designed to extract maximum labor before death. Most prisoners died within months. Klaus survived through a combination of luck, physical resilience, and the motivation provided by his promise to Ekaterina. He kept the letter hidden on his body at all times, wrapped in waxed cloth to protect it from moisture. During the worst moments, the coldest winters, the times when death seemed easier than continuing, he would take out the letter and reread it, reminding himself why survival mattered. In 1950, Klaus was released as part of a general amnesty. He was 29 years old, but looked 50. He had lost most of his teeth, suffered from chronic lung disease, and carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. But he was alive, and he still had the letter. He returned to Germany through a complex repatriation process. When he finally arrived in Bavaria, his family barely recognized him. His mother cried. His father, who had also served in the Wehrmacht, asked no questions about where Klaus had been or what he had experienced. Klaus showed them the letter. He told them about Ekaterina, about the rubble clearing in Stalingrad, about his promise to tell the truth. His father was angry. He said talking about war crimes would bring shame on the family, that Germans needed to move forward, not dwell on the past. Klaus said, "I made a promise. I'm keeping it." Klaus spent the rest of his life fulfilling his promise. He spoke at schools, wrote articles, gave interviews to historians documenting the Eastern Front. He was always honest about his role, not a major perpetrator, but a participant through action and inaction. He described the villages burned, the civilians terrorized, the systematic brutality of the Wehrmacht's occupation. His testimony was controversial in 1950s Germany, where most former soldiers preferred silence or denial about Eastern Front atrocities. Klaus received threats. His family faced social ostracism. Some former Wehrmacht soldiers called him a traitor. Klaus didn't care. He had promised Ekaterina he would tell the truth. That promise mattered more than his comfort or reputation. In 1965, Klaus published a memoir titled The Rubble of Stalingrad. The book detailed his experiences as a POW, his relationship with Ekaterina, and his commitment to bearing witness. The book sold modestly but reached important audiences, educators, historians, younger Germans trying to understand their parents' generation. One chapter of the book focused entirely on Ekaterina. Klaus described her as the woman who taught me that justice requires perpetrators to fully understand what they've done, not just suffer for it. She could have killed me. She chose instead to make me remember. That choice saved my life and gave it purpose. Klaus tried multiple times to find Ekaterina, to let her know he had kept his promise. He wrote to Soviet authorities, to veterans organizations, to anyone who might help locate her. He received no responses. The Soviet Union did not encourage correspondence between former POWs and their guards. Klaus never learned what happened to Ekaterina, but he never stopped looking. Ekaterina had continued working as a POW guard until 1948, when most German prisoners had been released or transferred. She then returned to civilian life, working as a teacher in a reconstructed village near Stalingrad. She never married. The war had taken too much from her. She had no family left, and building new connections felt impossible when so much of her identity was tied to loss. She kept the memory of Klaus, though. Not fondly. He was still a German soldier who had participated in her country's destruction, but with a form of respect. He had been willing to acknowledge guilt, to carry shame, to promise truth-telling. That was rare. In 1968, Ekaterina received an unexpected package. It was a copy of Klaus's memoir, The Rubble of Stalingrad, sent by a German historian who had been researching POW experiences and had connected Ekaterina's name to Klaus's accounts. Ekaterina read the book over one long night. She cried reading Klaus's descriptions of clearing rubble, of finding her family photograph, of their conversations. She cried reading his commitment to bearing witness, his acknowledgement that the Wehrmacht had committed atrocities, his refusal to hide behind just following orders. She wrote a letter to Klaus, through the German historian. The letter was formal, measured. She acknowledged reading his book. She said he had kept his promise. She said that mattered. The historian forwarded the letter to Klaus. When he received it, he wept. It was the first contact in 23 years, proof that Ekaterina had survived, that she knew he had kept his word. They began corresponding through the historian. The letters were infrequent, once or twice a year, and carefully written to avoid political sensitivity. But they maintained contact until Klaus's death in 1982. Klaus Hoffman died in 1982 at age 61, his health destroyed by his years in Coloma. At his funeral, his daughter read passages from his memoir, including his descriptions of Ekaterina and his promise to tell the truth. Several historians attended the funeral, recognizing Klaus as one of the rare Wehrmacht veterans willing to honestly confront the Eastern Front's atrocities. His testimony had contributed to important historical documentation about the war. Ekaterina Volkov died in 1991 at age 68, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Her obituary in the local Volgograd newspaper mentioned her wartime service as a POW guard, but provided few details. After her death, her colleagues found a box of letters, Klaus's correspondence, along with a worn copy of his memoir. They also found a journal where Ekaterina had written extensively about her experiences as a guard, her evolving understanding of justice and revenge, and her complicated relationship with Klaus. One entry, dated 1970, read, "I thought revenge would heal me. It didn't. Recognition healed me. Seeing a perpetrator fully acknowledge what he did, carry that weight honestly, refuse to hide. Klaus gave me that. I gave him the chance to be more than what he had been. Maybe that's the best justice we can create from ruins. The journal was eventually donated to the Volgograd War Museum, where it remains in their archives, a testament to the moral complexity of the POW experience on both sides. Klaus and Ekaterina's story has been studied by historians, psychologists, and conflict resolution specialists. It represents a rare case where perpetrator and victim developed a relationship based on honest acknowledgement rather than denial or simple forgiveness. Their descendants met in 2005 at a ceremony commemorating the 60th anniversary of the war's end. Klaus's daughter and Ekaterina's niece, her sister's daughter who had survived the war, spoke together about their relatives' complicated relationship. They emphasized that the story wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation in any simple sense. It was about the hard work of honest recognition. When people ask what it was like for German POWs to be guarded by Soviet women who had survived Wehrmacht atrocities, the answer is unbearably complex. It was fear of justified revenge. It was recognition of guilt that couldn't be denied when faced with survivors. It was the slow, painful process of seeing victims as humans rather than abstractions. It was the beginning of moral reckoning for some prisoners and defensive denial for others. For the women guards, it was the complicated work of administering justice to men they had every reason to hate. It was wrestling with the question of whether revenge satisfied anything or whether some form of recognition mattered more. It was making impossible choices about when to show mercy and when to enforce harshness. Klaus and Ekaterina's relationship doesn't provide simple answers. It doesn't suggest that victims should forgive perpetrators or that perpetrators can earn redemption through suffering. Instead, it demonstrates that justice requires perpetrators to fully understand their crimes, to see the specific human cost, to carry that weight honestly, to refuse the comfort of denial. That work is hard. Most perpetrators avoid it. Most victims don't want to facilitate it. But when it happens, when perpetrator and victim can engage in honest recognition, something meaningful emerges. Not healing exactly, but truth. And truth matters. The pattern Klaus and Ekaterina developed, harsh accountability combined with opportunities for the perpetrator to demonstrate understanding, appears in successful transitional justice processes worldwide. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, post-genocide Rwanda's Gacaca courts, and other restorative justice programs share elements of this approach. The core insight is that justice isn't just punishment or forgiveness. Justice is recognition. Perpetrators fully acknowledging what they did, victims being seen and heard, society understanding the truth rather than comfortable lies. That's what Klaus's testimony accomplished. He didn't erase his guilt. He didn't earn forgiveness. But he bore honest witness, making it harder for future generations to deny or minimize what happened. That's what Ekaterina's approach to guarding accomplished. She didn't just punish Klaus, she forced him to see the human cost of his actions, giving him the opportunity to respond with honesty rather than denial. Both choices mattered. Both contributed to historical truth-telling that continues to echo today. This story matters because the dynamics it reveals, perpetrator guilt, victim rage, the possibility of recognition without forgiveness, the importance of truth-telling, repeat across conflicts. After every war, societies face questions about how to handle perpetrators. Do we execute them, imprison them, forgive them, ignore their crimes, and move forward? Klaus and Ekaterina's story suggests a different path. Create conditions where perpetrators can acknowledge their crimes fully, where victims can be heard completely, where truth becomes the foundation for whatever comes next, whether that's reconciliation, separation, or simply honest coexistence. That work is still needed. There are conflicts happening now where future Klaus Hoffmans are participating in atrocities they'll later struggle to acknowledge. There are future Ekaterina Volkovs watching their homes burn, storing rage that will last decades. Understanding how perpetrator and victim can engage in honest recognition, how Klaus and Ekaterina managed it despite everything working against them, offers lessons for building justice in the aftermath of atrocity. The work is never finished. Every generation faces new conflicts, new atrocities, new questions about justice and accountability and truth. Klaus and Ekaterina's story doesn't provide a formula, but it provides evidence that honest recognition is possible, that it matters, that it's worth the immense effort required. That's why this story still matters, 80 years later. Because the work they did, perpetrator bearing witness, victim creating space for recognition, is the work we still need today. And that work begins with telling the truth, even when it's unbearably complicated.